Here on the 90-Second Mycology YouTube channel, we like to push the limits on how far we can go in growing our own gourmet and medicinal mushrooms at home without a pressure cooker. This YouTube channel focuses on using our favorite 90-second microwavable brown rice that's perfect every time in 90 seconds in order to grow our own mushrooms at home without a pressure cooker. And this does tend to upset a lot of people who have been growing mushrooms for 30 years because they've got all of these expensive equipment setups and grains and everything, and we are achieving the same results here without any of those things. Now don't get me wrong, of course you can always move on from here and do whatever you please, but we're going to get right into this right here. Today we're going to prepare some yellow popping corn to use for our mushroom grain spawn. I've got some Always a Good Deal Walfart brand right here, and I've just got some regular wide mouth quart jars underneath it. Using popcorn for your grain spawn is a step up above brown rice. You can also cook and sterilize your own brown rice at home, and don't worry, I've got a very special video on that coming up soon where we're going to do just that and even more, so stay tuned for that. But brown rice has a lifespan. If you've got stuff colonizing for a month and a half, the brown rice is going to start to break down and turn into mush from the mushroom mycelium. So if you've got some bad genetics or a mushroom strain that just takes forever to colonize, brown rice is not the best choice. But I'll always say that if you've got grains that are ready and you're not ready to use them, you can always just put them in the refrigerator to slow everything down. As long as it doesn't freeze, it won't kill the mycelium. It'll just kind of put it to sleep and it'll stay dormant until you're ready to use it. Popcorn has a longer lifespan than brown rice. It doesn't break down as easily when the mycelium is consuming it. The reason why we can prepare our own brown rice and popcorn without a pressure cooker is because these grains are sold for human consumption. So they're generally already pretty clean coming out of the factory where they're prepared and manufactured. If you wanted to use something like the animal feed corn or deer corn or other animal feed like rye berries or whole oats, then you would definitely want to use a pressure cooker because unfortunately those grains are just not as clean and full of all sorts of mold spores and other things that you definitely would like to use a pressure cooker with to make sure you're completely sterile and completely ready to go. But we're going to continue with the yellow popcorn for this video. We're going to prepare it for mushroom grain spawn without a pressure cooker. Let's move on to actually preparing the popcorn. So I've got a regular pot here. It's going to need a lid, obviously. What I'm going to do is put the popcorn in here dry and then fill it up to where it's just about 2 inches above the popcorn. You want to have enough water that the popcorn can actually become hydrated with it. Stop, mix it around. And this is the step where you might see a lot of people add some coffee grounds, add some gypsum, add any other type of nutrition, sugar. We're going to keep it as simple as possible and just leave it as it is. This is going to be bare popcorn, cooked and sterilized, prepared perfectly just for your own mushroom grain spawn. Everybody's stove is going to be different, of course. What we want to do is bring this popcorn up to a simmer, and we're going to want to simmer it for around an hour. It takes longer for the popcorn kernels to actually absorb the moisture. So once I get this up to a simmer, we don't want a rolling boil. We just want to simmer it, and once it starts simmering, we'll set the timer for an hour. I've got this at a low simmer and I've got a spoon here. I'm going to keep that spoon close by so that I can stir these grains periodically just to keep it even. We don't want any of the grains ending up stuck to the bottom cooking. You can see one of them already got burnt while it was warming up, but that's alright. So now I'll go ahead and set my timer for an hour. This is going to regain the heat after I put the lid back on it. And throughout that hour, I'll periodically stop by and give it a little stir. One 32-ounce bag of popcorn like that is going to fill up around 3 of these quart jars. So while the popcorn is simmering, I'll grab these jars and wash them out with some soap and water. And you might be wondering, why would I do that if I'm going to sterilize it? And it's just because being redundant doesn't hurt anything, especially when you're dealing with keeping things clean and sanitary. Our time is up and I've turned off the heat. Now let's take a look at these grains up close. You might find that some of the grains did end up bursting and getting smushed. The best way to check the popcorn is to grab a kernel, squish it between your fingers, and if it doesn't squish right away, that's perfect. So what you want to do is bite it in half And if you can bite it easily like this, and then be able to smush it after you bite it, then it's perfect. I don't have a sieve or a strainer or a colander that's big enough for that 32-ounce bag of popcorn, but a pasta pot is going to work just fine. So I'm going to dump the popcorn in here, let it drain out a little bit. Now, periodically you want to shake this popcorn around so that we can get some of that steam and moisture to evaporate off of it. This is why a pasta pot is pretty good for this, because you can really shake it around and mix it up to let some of the steam and moisture evaporate off the kernels. You want to give this another 45 minutes to really sit and drain while you come over and periodically just mix it up. So if you come by and you think, hey, it's looking pretty dry after a little bit, well, go ahead, grab it, shake it up, mix it up. Keep distributing all that moisture, and then come back and check it again in a little bit. You may see people do that tissue paper or napkin or paper towel test, where you take some of the grains and put it on the paper towel, and then if it leaves any moisture behind, then they're still not dry enough. We can do that. Give it one more shake and roll around. Now reach in there, grab a few kernels. They feel nice and plump. Set it on our paper towel. Let it sit for about 10 seconds. Dump the grains back in. And the paper towel is still relatively dry. So you can always use that test as well. But I let mine sit and dry just long enough to reach the perfect moisture content on the outside. Because what matters is the moisture content that's now on the inside of the grains. Next, I'll get to work on filling up these quart jars. You want to make sure they're dry on the inside. I do it just like this. We've got 2 of the quart jars filled up right at the 3-cup line on the quart jars, and then we're left with 1 more here in the back, right at the 2-cup line. So 32-ounce bag of popcorn, 3 quart jars, and this leaves a perfect amount of room if you end up wanting to do a grain-to-grain transfer with some of your other grains that you might have colonizing. But if not, it's still perfect for a spore syringe or liquid culture syringe. Now let's go over the lids. You may notice this whole time I didn't mention anything about modifying your lids. That's exactly what we're not going to do. Simply put the lids on upside down like this. Put the band on it. We don't want it completely tight. What you want to do is just finger tight. Finger tight means you get it just enough to where the jar starts moving after you've screwed it on. So you can easily unscrew it and you just get it finger tight until the jar starts moving. And because this lid is upside down, it will not create a hermetic seal on the jar. These jars will still be able to breathe through this finger tight lid like this. So I'll go over that again real quick right here. I'm holding the back of the jar with my fingers as I'm just making the top finger tight until it catches, and now it's rotating the whole jar. That's finger tight and it's still breathable. Now I'll tell you right now that you don't need tin foil on top of these jars because these lids are not modified. The reason why people put tin foil over their jars is because they usually have a synthetic filter disc or micropore paper tape on top, and that foil acts as a shield to kind of stop any of the moisture from dripping on top of the filter and leaking through into the grains. You can still choose to put the foil over these lids. It can always help to act as sort of a dust cover as you're moving your jars from the pot to your inoculation area or anything like that. But with unmodified lids like this, and you got them finger tight so they're still breathable, the moisture does not really become a problem. But I'm going to go ahead and put the foil on top just to act as a little dust cover. Now that I've got my little dust cover on all of my jars, I went through and made sure they're all still finger tight. Still loose lid can be unscrewed, but tighten it just enough to where it catches the jar and rotates with it. Again, that's finger tight because we're not forming a hermetic seal on these jars. We want them to still be able to breathe throughout the sterilization process as well as the colonization process. What we want to do is basically steam sterilize the jars. So you want a pot that's big enough to hold your quart jars, but you also want to be able to raise them up from the bottom of the pot so that the water can boil underneath them and steam them. You don't want to cook the jars directly on the bottom of the pot because then you could end up cooking the grains through the glass. So if you've got some extra mason jar rings laying around, you can definitely use those as a makeshift trivet. Again, depending on the size of your pot, you need to be able to have the lid sit on top of it and be sealed. But of course, if you don't have any extra mason jar rings or any other sort of trivet, you can always continue to use the pasta pot setup just like this. and that's what I'm going to do here. Also keep in mind that we're going to run a steam sterilization cycle, so you want to be able to have enough water in your pot to run for at least 2 hours. 2 hours is more than enough time to steam sterilize some popcorn because again, it's sold for human consumption and it's pretty clean straight out of the factory. So I'm going to fill this up just to the bottom of this pasta pot for now, and it's okay if you go a little over. You can go about like an inch up the jars, it's fine. It's not a big deal. A lot of the water will end up boiling off anyway. Go ahead and load the jars into the pot, just like this. Before we get started, just double check the lids on your jars and make sure they are loose. If they're more loose than finger tight, that's alright as well. You want them to be able to breathe. You don't want any glass blowing up in here. I'm gonna get this started into a boil before we turn it down to a simmer. And this is my pot lid right here. It looks a little funky, but my nice glass lid for this fell and shattered, unfortunately. So I didn't even know these existed, but this is a universal size pot lid, and once the heat starts going, it works pretty well. It's silicone and it helps to create a nice seal on top. So this will hold our steam in as it steam sterilizes our popcorn, but for right now we're going to get it up to a rolling boil, turn it down to a nice simmer so we can steam sterilize for at least 2 hours. Now that this is at a rolling boil, you can see and probably hear it in there. I am going to go ahead and turn it down. Everybody's stove is going to be different. You want just a slow, low simmer for 2 hours. So now I'm going to go ahead and set my timer for 2 hours. Now remember that common sense will almost always prevail here. You're going to want to continue to check on that water level in there for the 2 hours. You don't want it boiling dry, that's going to be a disaster. If you need to add some water, that's perfectly okay. You can also notice that depending on your lid type, as that moisture from the steam gathers on top and drips back down, that's the reason why people add the tin foil to their modified jars, because it stops those drops of water from leaking inside of the filters on top of their jars, as well as all the accumulating steam and stuff like that. But in this case, with our unmodified lids, this isn't an issue. I just use the foil as a sort of dust cover. 2 hours is up, so that means I'm going to turn this heat off and I'm going to leave it off. You can see that preparing your own popcorn for mushroom grain spawn without a pressure cooker is pretty much an all evening affair. If you've made it to this point of the day or the night, it's probably time for you to go to bed anyway. So you might as well just let this sit overnight to cool off on the stove, and that's exactly what I'm going to do right here. There is a method of sterilizing your grains inside of the oven if you bake them at around 275 degrees Fahrenheit. Even if you follow the proper techniques and recipes that people use for oven sterilization, sometimes it just throws everything off. But you can try that as well if it's something you want to look into. It has now officially been overnight, and before I remove these jars, I'm going to tighten all the lids because we're going to end up shaking these up to distribute any of this excess moisture in here. Just going through, tightening each lid, leaving my dust cover on it, and now let's take a closer look at the jars. Just like if you pressure cooked this corn, you would end up with some of this excess moisture inside of the jar, and that's normal. That's just some of the moisture from the grains coming out and condensating on the inside of the jar. So after we pressure cook or we steam sterilize just like this, all we do is we just shake the grain jars up to help redistribute some of that moisture, and over time the grains will reabsorb that moisture. Now that they've been shaken up, we can go ahead and loosen the lid just a little bit, help dissipate some of the moisture. My personal preference is to just let them sit a little longer to help some of that moisture get reabsorbed by the grains, as well as to just kind of evaporate through our little unmodified lids here. I let these sit for about a day with the lids loose and the dust covers on them. So I'll take these dust covers off for now. And you can see that the jars have definitely come back to their regular moisture content. No more condensation. No more wetness around the grains. Looking nice and ready to inoculate. This is definitely something that you want to prepare ahead of time, because you can see it takes almost 2 days to get it right without a pressure cooker. If you want to speed the process up, then you definitely want to look into getting a pressure canner. I have a video on this channel which is an introduction to pressure cookers and pressure canners. Even though the names are used interchangeably, there is a difference between the two appliances. So if that's something you're interested in, go ahead and check that video out. Don't be worried about this right here. That's just one of the burnt grains from when we were starting to boil the grains up. Next up, I'm going to inoculate these 3 jars with 3 different inoculation methods. First one will be a liquid culture syringe, the second one will be a grain-to-grain transfer, and the third one will be a spore syringe. Spore syringe is going to take the longest to show anything because the spores have to germinate and then find another compatible spore and basically mate with it and all that good stuff to continue growing on into mycelium. And then the liquid culture and grain-to-grain transfers are going to be the next up to see which one is going to be fastest. But these are all different species and varieties of mushrooms, so we're still going to see different results in these 3 different jars. I will be using my unmodified still air box here for this. If you don't know what this is, it's just an unmodified 58 quart tote that I flip over onto my counter, and then I hang it over the edge just a little bit, and then I position myself below it so I can work up inside of it just like this. Get a nice spray down of some isopropyl alcohol. I'll do my liquid culture syringe inoculation first here, and because this is a used needle, I'm going to flame sterilize it outside of my still air box. I'm going to remove the dust cover first so I can work with the lid easier here. I'll just squirt some around the sides of the jar. With the liquid culture inoculation, since it's already got viable and established mycelium in the syringe, we can tighten this lid up just a little bit and mix these grains around to distribute this liquid culture throughout the grains. This is going to help increase all of the inoculation points of the liquid culture so the mycelium has more grains spread out to start growing on for faster colonization. Don't worry about these dark grains, those are just some of the burnt grains from when we were first hydrating the popcorn. Now I will loosen the lid just a little bit past finger tight, and leave my dust cover on there, and we're good to go. That one's finished. Next I'll work on the grain-to-grain transfer. I'm just doing a light little spray down of isopropyl in between everything. Now this grain jar is so small I could have taken the time to break it up and shake it up and everything, but since my hands have been sanitized pretty well and I'm in a pretty sanitary still air environment, I'm going to go ahead and just use my finger to break up some of the grain on top and dump it into this jar right here. Fully colonized grains like this are pretty resistant to contamination because the mycelium has become nice and established with a nice immune system. So sanitary hands are just fine when exposing colonized grains like this. If you haven't seen my grain-to-grain transfer video with the 90-second microwavable brown rice, you can go ahead and check that video out on this channel as well. Same idea here. I'm going to put the lid on and I will tighten it just for a second so that we can mix these colonized grains around with the uncolonized grains. And now that's going to increase the amount of inoculation points all throughout the grains for faster colonization. I'm going to loosen the lid just a little bit past finger tight so it can breathe. It's not completely sealed because again our actual lids are upside down so the seal is away from the jar. And I'm going to replace my dust cover. And now the grain-to-grain transfer is done. And now we can move on to the spore syringe inoculation. Real quick, general isopropyl alcohol wipe down again. Remember, if you've got a spore syringe, to always shake it up very well. This one still has its sterile needle in the package, so I will not need to be flame sterilizing it, which is a good thing. Looking pretty well shaken up. Remove my dust cover here. Remove my lid band. I'll go ahead and get my needle attached here. Now the needle is no longer sterile, so I would want to flame sterilize again if I ever use it after this. Squirt a little bit of liquid around the sides again, not really measuring, but I'm judging about 1 to 2 cc's for this quart jar, that's plenty. Remove my needle and replace my little lure lock syringe plug just like this. The spore syringe inoculation is complete, and this time I'm not going to mix it up. I'm just going to replace the lid just a little bit looser than finger tight. It can still breathe, and I'll replace my dust cover. Now the reason why I do not mix up the grains after a spore syringe inoculation is because your spores need to germinate and then meet another compatible spore and then continue growing into mycelium. If you by chance had a pretty sparse spore syringe, mixing up these grains can spread the spores out way too much, and it's going to take even longer for them to find each other and continue growing and becoming established. So spore syringe inoculations, I personally do not like to mix up the grains. A lot of people will debate that. That's just my personal preference, so if you want to mix it up, go ahead, but I'm not going to. Remember to stay clean and organized throughout the whole process, because it's pretty easy to forget what you've inoculated here. So you can see I've got my labels on everything. Just for my own reference, the only thing that really matters is the type of inoculation method for this particular video. Now I can go ahead and put these into my little mushroom spawn incubation box. I've got a video on this channel on how to create a nice, cheap, easy, simple mushroom incubation box as temperatures get a little colder outside. And before I put them in my box, just want to double check that the lids are loose enough to be able to breathe for the gas exchange while these grain jars colonize. They don't have to be super loose, but you don't want them airtight either. Since we have our lids upside down, it's going to be easier for the mycelium to breathe through the loose lids. And don't forget, whether you've got fully colonized grain or liquid culture syringe or spore syringe, you can always store it in your refrigerator for when you need it next. You just don't want the stuff to freeze. As long as you keep it in a cool, dark spot, the stuff will last for a very long time. It is now December 14th, which means we are just 1 day short of 2 weeks. But within 1 day, not too much is going to change, so it's finally time to end this video. And again, this is the reason why these videos take a long time, is because I take the time to let this stuff grow out so that you can actually get a real-time view at what's going on. So before we take a closer look, I will go through and tighten all of these lids and remove all of my dust covers so that we can get real up close and personal. Here we are with inoculation method number 1, which was a liquid culture, and within about 2 weeks it has taken over most of the jar, and this is definitely ready for a break and shake to really finish colonizing all of these grains. This might look a little weird, but that's just where some of the grains were pushed up against the side of the glass. So once this is broke and shook, it's going to colonize just fine, and it'll look normal and ready to spawn to a bulk substrate. And don't worry about that little spot right there. That is just that burnt grain that we've been tracking throughout this video. Here's a look at the bottom of the jar. Everything is looking nice, fully colonized almost, ready for a break and shake. That was the liquid culture inoculation method number 1. Here is inoculation method number 2, which was a grain-to-grain transfer. Also the same thing. Even though this is less grain, it pretty much almost fully colonized this whole container as it is. And this would also benefit from a nice break and shake to really finish off this corner of colonization right here. And then this will also be good to spawn to a bulk substrate. Here is our last inoculation method, the multi-spore syringe. Now, within 2 weeks, all we have to show for is a little bit of mycelium right there and a little bit of mycelium right there. Just as we predicted, and just as it's going to be when you inoculate grains like this with a multi-spore syringe. As I explained during the inoculation, the spores need a germination period before they can actually start to connect and grow out to form that mycelium. And 2 to 3 weeks is the average time for spore inoculations to show any growth like this. Now with popcorn, to speed this process up, I skipped over the step of adding coffee or gypsum. If you add coffee to the popcorn, the spores and mycelium actually starts to colonize the little bits of coffee grounds before it spreads to the popcorn grains. So adding coffee is beneficial if you know you're going to do a multi-spore inoculation, because those little tiny itty-bitty pieces of coffee grounds are going to become little itty-bitty tiny inoculation points for all of the mycelium. So if those coffee grounds are rampant throughout the popcorn grains, it's going to be able to colonize that coffee and then spread out even further around the popcorn. Since I chose not to do that for the sake of simplicity, I now have to deal with the very slow process of this brand new multi-spore mycelium trying to colonize these huge popcorn grains. So although popcorn is a step up above brown rice, depending on your inoculation method, it might not be the most beneficial unless you add all of the extra steps necessary to help a multi-spore inoculation, such as coffee or gypsum. Gypsum just kind of adds some calcium and sulfur to help the mycelium grow and feed off of some extra nutrition while it's trying to colonize these popcorn grains. But preparing popcorn in this simple sense without any additives, you would then benefit from adding those additives to your bulk substrate when you go to spawn these grains. So if you're going to prepare this popcorn to use for mushroom grain spawn, it's most beneficial for a grain-to-grain and liquid culture inoculation. If you know you're going to use a multi-spore inoculation, at least add some coffee, or if you're patient enough, you can just wait for these two little spots of mycelium to finally take over all of these grains. Now granted, there could be spots inside of the popcorn that have also germinated and they just have not grown out to the surface yet that we can see. I'm still not going to make the executive decision to mix these grains up yet, because these little spots of mycelium are still so weak and brand new that it really would not benefit from that right now, and I'm just going to leave it as it is to colonize even further, which is the typical multi-spore inoculation and colonization time of about a month and a half. The only thing you can actually speed up with a multi-spore syringe inoculation is the preparation of your grain spawn, and if you still wanted to stick with popcorn, you would get the most speed out of using a pressure cooker or a pressure canner to prepare the popcorn for mushroom grain spawn. But even then, if you're just getting started, you can always inoculate some of the 90-second microwavable brown rice that's perfect every time in 90 seconds. It still does just fine for mushroom grain spawn. Even if it's not fully colonized, when you go to spawn it, you can just brush off the uncolonized brown rice grains. Even though there's a variation in the species and variety of mushrooms used to inoculate these popcorn grains, we can see that the liquid culture and the grain-to-grain transfer turned out exponentially well, obviously compared to the multi-spore syringe inoculation. And that's how it's always going to be no matter what kind of grain spawn you use. A multi-spore syringe inoculation is always going to take the longest to start colonizing. Of course, you can mix and match different grains if you choose to do a grain-to-grain transfer. It does not matter if you mix popcorn and brown rice or brown rice and popcorn. The only thing that matters with a grain-to-grain inoculation is that you're taking already established and viable mycelium. It just so happens to be attached to some grains, and then you're using that to inoculate some more grains. So even though this grain-to-grain transfer right here was just inoculated with other colonized popcorn, I could have taken some 90-second microwavable brown rice that was fully colonized and use that as a grain-to-grain transfer to inoculate this jar. Mixing and matching your grains for a grain-to-grain transfer is no issue at all, because it all comes down to the mycelium that you're putting inside of the uncolonized grains. And how I go about breaking up these grains to break and shake is simply take my dog's favorite toy right here, bang the jar against it. Of course, you can use something like a bike tire or a car tire, the old traditional methods that have been passed around for 30 plus years. You do not want to bang the jar against a hard surface to break up these grains because you can end up shattering it. So always use a soft surface to try to break up those grains. And one of the reasons why popcorn is so good for grain spawn is because it's so easily broken up like this. Couple taps with that big tennis ball, and now I'm able to freely shake this jar and mix up all of those colonized grains with the uncolonized grains. And within less than another week, this will be ready to go and spawn to a bulk substrate. Same thing with the grain-to-grain jar here. Give it a nice little beating. And now we can see all the grains are nicely separated, and I am easily able to shake and mix these all throughout the jar, just like this. And you can really see the difference in the coloring of the grains. The mycelium turned the other ones kind of a darker brown, while that section of uncolonized grains with this grain-to-grain transfer was still that traditional popcorn yellow. So that just kind of worked itself out. as a point of reference to make sure you've really mixed up all of these grains. And the same thing here, probably less than a week, this will be fully colonized and ready to spawn to a bulk substrate. In conclusion, you can see that we were able to successfully create our own mushroom grain spawn without using a pressure cooker. And as I explained in the beginning, that is because popcorn is sold for human consumption, so it's generally pretty clean out of the factory. And although that sounds pretty bad to say out loud that our food is made in factories, but it's unfortunately true right now, and that's just the way life goes. So keep in mind that common sense will almost always prevail, and sometimes 30-year-old forgotten information that's been swept under the rug works just fine even 30 years later in current times.